In the winter of 1974, Al Pacino sat alone in a Manhattan apartment with a bottle of whiskey and a decision that would have erased one of cinema's greatest careers before it truly began. The Godfather had made him famous, but fame had brought a darkness he couldn't escape. The critics loved him, but he was convinced he was a fraud. The world saw a rising star, but he saw a man drowning in expectations he could never meet. On the night he had decided would be his last, a letter arrived that shouldn't have existed, from someone who had no way of knowing he needed to be saved. What that letter contained and who wrote it remained one of Hollywood's most closely guarded secrets for nearly 50 years. If you remember the 1970s, when success didn't guarantee happiness and fame could destroy as easily as it could elevate, make sure you're subscribed. The stories we're uncovering aren't about the glory, they're about the cost of greatness and the moments when everything almost ended. The Godfather's release in March of 1972 changed Al Pacino's life in ways that looked like blessing but felt like curse. Overnight, he went from a struggling theater actor making barely enough to pay rent to one of the most recognizable faces in America. The film became a cultural phenomenon, breaking box office records and establishing itself as perhaps the greatest American movie ever made. Pacino's performance as Michael Corleone was widely praised as a revelation, the arrival of a major new talent who could hold the screen against legends like Marlon Brando. But what nobody understood, what Pacino himself could barely articulate, was that the success felt completely disconnected from who he actually was. He had spent years studying at the Actors Studio on 44th Street, learning to disappear into characters, to use his own pain and experience as fuel for performances. Michael Corleone was supposed to be just another role, another opportunity to practice his craft. Instead, the character had consumed him so completely during filming that he couldn't find his way back to himself afterward. The method techniques that had served him so well in theater had become dangerous when applied to a character as dark and violent as Michael. While New York applauded, one apartment stayed silent, and nobody asked why. The months following The Godfather's release were marked by a mounting sense of unreality. Pacino would walk down New York streets and see his own face on magazine covers, hear people discussing Michael Corleone's transformation as if it were the most important thing in the world, attend parties where industry luminaries treated him like royalty. None of it felt real. He later described it as feeling like he was watching someone else's life from the outside, a stranger who happened to look like him receiving praise for work that he couldn't even remember doing clearly. The pressure to capitalize on his sudden success was immediate and overwhelming. Scripts poured in, each one offering more money than he had made in his entire life before The Godfather. Studios wanted him for leading roles in major productions. Directors who had never returned his phone calls now competed for his attention. His agents pushed him to strike while he was hot, to establish himself as a bankable star before the industry moved on to its next discovery. But Pacino felt paralyzed. Every script he read seemed shallow compared to The Godfather. Every role felt like a pale imitation of Michael Corleone. He was terrified of making the wrong choice and exposing himself as the fraud he believed himself to be. Applause roared. Nothing moved. Lee Strasberg, Pacino's mentor at the Actors Studio, recognized that his former student was in crisis. Strasberg had seen this pattern before with other actors who achieved sudden fame. The method required using your authentic emotional life as the foundation for performance, but when success arrived, that foundation could crack under the weight of public expectation and commercial pressure. Actors who had learned to access deep wells of personal pain for their work sometimes found that success didn't heal those wounds. It just made them more visible and harder to hide. What Strasberg told his inner circle that winter wasn't praise, it was a quiet alarm. Strasberg reached out to Pacino multiple times in the months after The Godfather, inviting him back to the Actors Studio, suggesting they work together on new material, offering to simply talk if Pacino needed someone who understood what he was going through. But Pacino had retreated into isolation. He stopped attending classes at the studio. He avoided old friends from his theater days. He turned down most social invitations. The few people who did see him during this period described him as hollow, going through the motions of being Al Pacino while clearly being somewhere else entirely in his mind. 3 calls, no answer. What Strasberg understood but couldn't articulate to his concerned colleagues was that Pacino was experiencing a kind of identity crisis that went beyond normal adjustment to fame. The actor had spent years using method techniques to inhabit other people's lives, to feel what characters felt, to think as they thought. But in playing Michael Corleone, a character defined by emotional shutdown and moral compromise, Pacino had perhaps gone too deep. Michael's coldness, his ability to cut himself off from feeling, had become a kind of template that Pacino couldn't shake. He was Michael's opposite in every way that mattered, sensitive and emotionally volatile, but he had learned too well how to access that shut-down state. Newspaper clippings from late '74 show a brief, unexplained hiatus in his public appearances. People close to the studio say that gap was no accident. When Francis Ford Coppola approached Pacino about reprising Michael Corleone for The Godfather Part 2, the proposal should have been a straightforward yes. The original film had been the most successful and critically acclaimed movie of 1972. Coppola was offering a chance to continue one of cinema's great character arcs. The money being offered was substantial. Any objective observer would have said this was an opportunity that couldn't be refused. After Coppola's offer, he vanished for 6 days. The plan for day 7 would have ended everything. But Pacino's response was complicated by the fact that he blamed Michael Corleone for his current psychological state. He had disappeared so completely into the character during the first film that he had lost himself. The thought of doing it again, of spending months inhabiting that darkness, felt like it might permanently damage something in him that was already badly fractured. He later told friends that he had genuinely considered turning down the role, walking away from what would become one of the greatest sequels ever made, because he didn't think he could survive the process. The decision paralyzed him for weeks. His agents were furious, unable to understand why he would even hesitate. Paramount executives began making contingency plans, considering whether they could recast the role if Pacino ultimately declined. Coppola himself grew increasingly frustrated, unable to comprehend why his star was treating this incredible opportunity as if it were a prison sentence. The glass sweated, so did he. What none of them understood was that Pacino wasn't debating a career move. He was trying to decide whether he wanted to continue living. The depression that had been building since The Godfather's release had reached a point where every day felt like an unbearable weight. Getting out of bed required effort he often couldn't summon. Simple decisions like what to eat or whether to answer the phone felt impossibly complicated. And the thought of returning to Michael Corleone, of diving back into that character's psychological darkness, seemed like it would push him past a point of no return. A studio fixer signed an NDA that still outlives him, and so does the rumor of what he saw. December 19, 1974. The date is reportedly corroborated by 2 people close to the production files, though the specific details remain protected by legal agreements and personal loyalty. Pacino was alone in his Upper West Side walk-up, a space he had been renting since before The Godfather, but that now felt like a tomb. He had been drinking steadily since early afternoon, not for pleasure but to numb himself enough to follow through on the decision he had finally made. The apartment was sparse, barely furnished despite his newfound wealth. Pacino had never been interested in material possessions, and in his current state he saw no point in decorating a space he wouldn't be occupying much longer. The walls were bare, the refrigerator was nearly empty. There were scripts piled on a table, each one a reminder of obligations he didn't feel capable of meeting. The phone had been unplugged for days because he couldn't handle talking to anyone. That morning, his journal held 4 words the estate refuses to release. He had written letters earlier in the day, final communications to his mother, to Lee Strasberg, to a few close friends from his theater days. The letters were matter-of-fact, apologetic but not melodramatic. He explained that he couldn't continue pretending to be the person everyone thought he was, that the gap between who he actually was and who he was expected to be had become unbridgeable. He thanked people for their support and apologized for disappointing them. The tone was eerily calm, the writing of someone who had moved past crisis into a kind of terrible clarity. 1 note, 4 words, everything tilting. Around 9 in the evening there was a knock at the door. Pacino almost didn't answer. He had told everyone he wasn't seeing visitors. He assumed it was probably his building superintendent or a delivery person who had the wrong apartment. But the knocking persisted, not aggressive but steady, the rhythm of someone who wasn't going to leave. Finally, Out of a combination of curiosity and a strange feeling that perhaps he should see one more person before following through on his plan, he opened the door. What happened next depends on which version of the story you hear. The most reliable accounts, pieced together from the few people who were told parts of the truth, suggest that it wasn't a person at the door but an envelope. It had been slipped under the door, but the sound Pacino heard was someone knocking to alert him to its presence before leaving quickly. The envelope had no return address, no identifying information beyond his name written in handwriting he didn't recognize. If that envelope hadn't arrived, 1970s American cinema would read differently, line by line. Inside was a letter, 3 pages written on blue-lined legal pad paper, that Pacino later described as the most important document he had ever read. The letter demonstrated such intimate knowledge of his psychological state, such specific understanding of the crisis he was experiencing, that it could only have come from someone who knew him deeply or who had experienced something similar themselves. But the handwriting wasn't familiar, and the details about the writer's own life didn't match anyone in Pacino's immediate circle. The letter began by acknowledging that fame had not brought the peace or validation that Pacino had perhaps unconsciously hoped for. It named specifically the feeling he had been experiencing, the sense that success had exposed him as a fraud rather than confirming his talent. The writer understood that The Godfather's acclaim had felt like a burden rather than a gift because it set expectations that Pacino believed he couldn't meet again. But then the letter shifted into something that genuinely shocked him. It talked about the specific danger of method acting when applied to dark characters without proper psychological boundaries. It described exactly what Pacino had experienced during The Godfather, the way Michael Corleone's emotional shutdown had become a template that he couldn't escape. The writer seemed to understand the technical aspects of method training in ways that suggested either direct experience with the technique or extensive knowledge of how it could go wrong. The letter foresaw a scene so precisely that when it happened, he locked the pages away for life. The most powerful section of the letter addressed the question of whether to do The Godfather Part 2. The writer acknowledged that returning to Michael Corleone felt dangerous, like it might complete the psychological damage that the first film had started. But then came an argument that Pacino had never considered. The letter suggested that the only way out of the darkness was through it, that playing Michael's complete moral destruction in the sequel might actually be what allowed Pacino to separate himself from the character finally and completely. The reasoning was almost therapeutic in nature. Michael Corleone in The Godfather Part 2 would reach a level of isolation and inhumanity that was so extreme it couldn't be sustained or romanticized. By playing that final descent, Pacino would be showing himself and the audience exactly where that path led, and in doing so he would be able to walk away from it. The letter suggested that what Pacino feared most about the sequel, the complete darkness of Michael's transformation, was actually the thing that would save him by making the character's tragedy so absolute that there would be no confusion between actor and role. The letter outlined with uncannily specific detail a scene that hadn't been written yet, a moment of profound isolation that would come near the end of Part 2. When that exact scene appeared in Coppola's script months later and was filmed exactly as the letter had described, Pacino was shaken by the accuracy of the prediction. The door knocked, breath returned. To this day, the identity of who wrote the letter remains uncertain. Pacino himself has never publicly confirmed or denied the various theories that have circulated over the years. The few people he showed the letter to were sworn to secrecy, and most of them kept that promise. What leaks there have been raise more questions than they answer. One theory suggests the letter came from Lee Strasberg himself, written in a deliberately disguised hand to make it seem like an outside perspective rather than advice from a mentor. Strasberg was known for using unconventional methods to reach students in crisis, and the letter's sophisticated understanding of method technique supports this theory. However, people close to Strasberg insist he never mentioned writing such a letter, and the few samples of disguised handwriting he produced for other purposes don't match. Another possibility is that the letter came from Marlon Brando. Despite the tension between them during the Godfather production, Brando had his own extensive history with psychological struggles related to fame and method acting. He understood better than almost anyone what Pacino was experiencing. The letter's insight into the specific dangers of playing dark characters matches Brando's own experiences with roles like Terry Malloy and Stanley Kowalski, but Brando's defenders argue he would never have been that vulnerable or helpful to someone he viewed as a rival. The real miracle wasn't who wrote it, but how they knew the date he'd chosen. A third theory, supported by some circumstantial evidence, is that the letter came from another actor who had experienced similar darkness after sudden fame, someone who had contemplated suicide themselves and found a way back. James Dean's name has been mentioned, though he died in 1955 before Pacino's crisis. Montgomery Clift, who struggled with similar demons and died in 1966, has also been suggested, though obviously couldn't have written a 1974 letter. The idea that it might have been Robert De Niro watching his peer self-destruct and offering anonymous help is intriguing but unconfirmed. Whatever the letter's source, its effect on Pacino was immediate and profound. He didn't suddenly become happy or confident. His depression didn't lift overnight. But something about reading words that so precisely described his experience, that validated his pain while offering a path forward, gave him enough psychological breathing room to step back from the edge. He later described it as feeling like someone had turned on a light in a room where he had been stumbling in darkness. The next morning, he called Francis Ford Coppola and told him he would do The Godfather Part 2. His conditions were simple and non-negotiable. He needed assurance that there would be support for his mental health during production. He wanted the filming schedule structured to give him regular breaks from being in Michael's headspace. And he wanted Coppola's understanding that if at any point the process became genuinely dangerous to his psychological well-being, he needed to be able to walk away without professional consequences. Coppola agreed to everything immediately. He later said that the conversation was strange because Pacino seemed to be negotiating terms for entering a war zone rather than making a movie, but Coppola was too grateful to have his star committed to the project to question the unusual requests. In retrospect, those conditions probably saved both Pacino's sanity and the film itself by preventing the kind of complete method immersion that had nearly destroyed the actor the first time. The filming of The Godfather Part 2 in 1974 was grueling, but Pacino approached it differently than he had the first film. He maintained boundaries between himself and Michael Corleone that he had failed to establish before. He spent time between takes deliberately stepping out of character, talking with crew members about mundane topics, reminding himself that this was a performance and not a possession. When he felt himself slipping too deeply into Michael's darkness, he would take the breaks his contract allowed and do things that reinforced his own identity separate from the character. The performance that resulted was extraordinary, widely considered even better than his work in the original Godfather. Playing Michael's complete moral disintegration, his transformation into a monster who destroys everyone who loves him in pursuit of power that brings no satisfaction, Pacino created one of cinema's most devastating character studies. The lake house scene, where Michael lies to Kay about ordering his brother-in-law's death, contains a coldness that is genuinely chilling. The final shots of Michael alone in his compound, surrounded by wealth and power, but utterly isolated from humanity, are among the most powerful images in film history. But what made the performance sustainable this time was that Pacino wasn't trying to become Michael. He was showing what happens when someone makes the choices Michael made, the inevitable endpoint of that path. The letter writer had been right. By playing the complete tragedy to its conclusion, Pacino was able to achieve distance from the character that he hadn't managed the first time. Michael Corleone's story ended in the sequel, and that ending allowed Pacino to walk away from the role without feeling like he was leaving part of himself behind. When The Godfather Part 2 was released in December of 1974, exactly 1 year after the night Pacino had contemplated suicide, the critical response was extraordinary. The film was praised as not just a worthy sequel but potentially better than the original, a rare achievement in cinema. Pacino's performance was singled out as a masterpiece, a portrayal of moral corruption and spiritual death that would influence actors for generations. The Academy Awards in the spring of 1975 should have been Pacino's moment of ultimate vindication. He was nominated for Best Actor, and many considered him the favorite. But in one of the Academy's most controversial decisions, the Oscar went to Art Carney for Harry and Tonto. Pacino's loss was widely considered a snub, a failure by the Academy to recognize one of the greatest performances in American film history. But Pacino's response to losing was telling. He seemed almost relieved rather than disappointed. Friends reported that he felt the loss took pressure off, that not winning meant he didn't have to live up to being an Oscar winner on top of everything else. The letter he had received a year earlier had predicted this possibility, suggesting that recognition wasn't what he actually needed and that external validation wouldn't heal what was broken inside him. The prediction had been accurate, and Pacino found comfort in that accuracy, even in the moment of losing. In the 50 years since that December night, Pacino has occasionally referenced the letter in oblique ways, without ever revealing its contents or confirming who wrote it. He has described it as the most important piece of writing he ever encountered, more influential on his life than any script or book. He has reportedly kept it in a safe deposit box, one of the few possessions he considers truly irreplaceable. He has reportedly shown it to a handful of people over the decades, each one sworn to secrecy about its contents. What we know from those who have seen it is that the letter was remarkable, not just for its insight, but for its specificity. It contained details about Pacino's psychological state that would have been impossible to know unless the writer had either observed him closely or experienced something nearly identical. It predicted aspects of how The Godfather Part 2 would affect him that proved eerily accurate when the film was made. And it offered advice about managing the relationship between art and identity that Pacino has apparently followed for the rest of his career. The letter also contained, according to the few reports that exist, a warning about fame's long-term effects. It suggested that the crisis Pacino was experiencing in 1974 wasn't a one-time event, but rather the first of multiple psychological challenges that would come with sustained celebrity. The writer predicted that Pacino would struggle with relationships, that he would find intimacy difficult because fame creates barriers that are hard to cross, and that he would need to consciously maintain boundaries between his public and private selves to survive psychologically intact. The decades that followed 1974 confirmed many of the letter's predictions. Pacino never married, despite several long-term relationships and 3 children with different partners. He has described himself as fundamentally unsuited for the kind of emotional vulnerability that marriage requires. The fame that came from The Godfather created a wall between him and normal human connection that he was never fully able to overcome. People who got close to him were always interacting partly with Al Pacino, the icon, rather than with the person he was underneath. His career was marked by periods of extraordinary work, followed by retreats from public life. After Scarface and the intense method immersion that role required, he took time away to recover psychologically. After Scent of a Woman and the Oscar win he finally received in 1992, he described feeling exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. The pattern suggested someone who had learned to manage the psychological costs of his work, but who still paid those costs with every intense role. The letter's influence on his approach to acting was profound and lasting. Pacino became known for being selective about roles in ways that seemed almost perverse to industry observers. He turned down parts that would have paid enormous sums and kept his name in the public eye. He chose smaller films and theater work that didn't carry the same pressure as major studio productions. The choices suggested someone guided by internal considerations rather than external career logic, and people who knew about the letter understood that he was following its advice about maintaining psychological boundaries. In the end, the mystery of who wrote the letter is perhaps less important than what it represented. Whether it came from a mentor, a peer, or some more mysterious source, the letter arrived at exactly the moment when Pacino needed external validation that his experience was real and survivable. It named what he was feeling with such precision that it made the pain less isolating. It offered a path forward that acknowledged the danger without pretending it didn't exist, and it predicted a future that, while difficult, was sustainable if he learned to protect himself. The letter also represented something larger about the costs of art created through method techniques. The approach that Lee Strasberg taught required using authentic emotional experience as the foundation for performance. For actors like Pacino, who had deep wells of pain and trauma to draw from, the method could create extraordinary work, but accessing that pain repeatedly, staying in dark emotional spaces for extended periods, came with psychological costs that the industry largely ignored. The letter's warning about these costs arrived when Pacino needed it most, and its advice apparently helped him navigate a career that lasted another 50 years without completely destroying him. Now in his 80s, Al Pacino occasionally discusses his career in interviews with a frankness that would have been impossible decades ago. He acknowledges the psychological toll that fame and intense roles took on him. He admits that there were periods when he struggled severely with depression and felt disconnected from normal human experience. He describes acting as both his salvation and his curse, the thing that gave his life meaning but that also required him to regularly visit psychological spaces that were genuinely dangerous. When asked about the low points, he sometimes references 1974 without providing details. He says it was the year he learned that success doesn't cure what's broken inside you, that external achievement can't heal internal wounds. He describes it as the year he had to decide whether his art was worth the cost it was extracting, and that the decision to continue came from unexpected help at exactly the right moment. The letter remains locked away, its contents known to only a handful of people who have kept their promise of secrecy for decades. Perhaps it will be made public after Pacino's death, offering future generations insight into one of cinema's greatest actors at his most vulnerable moment. Or perhaps it will remain private forever, a reminder that some things are too personal to share even with history. What matters is that on a December night in 1974, when Al Pacino had decided to end his life, words on a page convinced him there was a reason to continue. Everything that came after, every performance that moved audiences, every character that revealed something true about human nature, exists because someone took the time to write those words and make sure they reached someone who desperately needed them. The identity of that writer is one of Hollywood's last great mysteries. The impact of what they wrote is written across 50 years of American cinema. So here's the question that haunts everyone who knows this story. Who could have known Pacino well enough to write that letter, understood method acting deeply enough to offer that specific advice, and predicted the future with such eerie accuracy? Was it a mentor protecting his student, a fellow actor who had survived similar darkness, or something we can't explain? Drop your theory in the comments, and let's solve this 50-year mystery together. And tell us, which crisis do you want us to investigate next? The Serpico danger that was completely real, or the Scarface psychological breakdown we know happened? Your choice determines what we uncover next.